My name's Larry Scogan, and it's my good fortune to be the president of Bismarck State College, and I want to welcome all of you to our campus today. We always, Clay and I, this is our 5th year of doing these conversations, and we always try to gauge the audience by the weather, and we figured the weather was so nice out today we'd have a very small audience. So we're delighted that you all gave up being outside in the beautiful weather today and decided to come here, because this is really going to be a very, very exciting presentation. Before we get started, some administrative notes. First, if you did not pick up on your way in, please pick up on the way out the schedule for this next year's conversations. We'd be delighted to have an audience this size at every one of them as we work our way through the topics this year. And as I said, this is our 5th year. Which is very exciting. We've done this 4 years, so basically we've done 20 of these already, Clay, and it's just a lot of fun. And I will say, and some of you know this, and there are some new faces here, but when I conceived the idea that we would have Clay Jenkinson on our campus, it was to have a lecture series. So I asked him, and he said, no, I won't do that, but I'll sit on the stage with you and have conversations on various topics. So Clay is the creative mind behind doing this particular format, and I think it's worked out very, very well. And so we've done 4 years, and we're on to our 5th year. So please pick this up on your way out. Inside of it, there's a little survey for you to give us an evaluation of the program. And we do read them, and Robin is good about compiling the information for us. So if you have topics that you would like us to discuss, or if you have any suggestions for improvement for the program, please fill that out as well. She also, out on the table, I don't think I have one here, maybe I do. She has a little card like this, a little white card, that you can put your name and email and your address on it, and Robin will make sure to send you notices when these programs are coming up. So if you're not on our mailing list already, you can fill out one of these little white cards, and Robin will certainly get the information to you. The only other administrative note is that you notice we're really crammed over here on the side of the stage because we're competing with the set here, and there is a marvelous theater production. We do just fantastic here, and if you've ever been to our theater productions, you know how good they are. And we've got one coming up, and so we're competing with the set here today. Dancing at Lunas? Okay, thank you, Dean. Begins October 17th. At 7:30, and it runs the 17th through the 21st, and on the 21st it's 2:30 in the afternoon right here in the auditorium. So we'd be delighted if you'd all come back and see what a great theatrical productions we put on here on our campus. And so I think that's the rest of, or all the administrative notes. Now I'd like to jump right in. We've got an exciting program today, and so I'm going to jump right into some introductions here. Generally, Clay says we're going to forego an introduction of him, but I'm not going to, because this is our first one of the season, so it's... Go ahead, Clay.
I just want to say 2 things before you begin. Well, 3. How great this is that we get to keep doing this and to have a guest as extraordinary as William Foley. But I think we have some young people, some high school students with us today, and we're so glad, and we appreciate your being here. And please stay as long as you can and ask questions, but it's great to have college students and high school students come to these as well as our usual audience.
Oh,
and then the third thing is that we should just get on to the introduction of Dr. Foley.
I'm going to introduce Clay Jenkinson. One of the things about being president is I get to make some of these decisions. So I have just made a presidential decision.
Wow.
So it's now my privilege to introduce Mr. Clay Jenkinson, Bismarck State College Distinguished Scholar of the Humanities. Clay, a Rhodes and Danforth Scholar, is a published author and one of the leading public humanities scholars in the United States. He hosts a nationally syndicated radio program from Bismarck. Rodeo program.
That's rodeo, Larry.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour, and works as a speaker, consultant, and facilitator. Clay was a major contributor to Ken Burns' public television series Jefferson and has portrayed Jefferson in 49 states before Supreme Court justices, the president, state legislators, and countless audiences, as well as the Today Show, Politically Incorrect, and CNN. Clay has written more than 10 books, the latest being, and that's one of the topics here today, The Character of Meriwether Lewis, Explorer in the Wilderness, and the newly released For the Love of North Dakota and Other Essays, Sundays with Clay in the Bismarck Tribune. He is currently director of the Dakota Institute through the Fort Mandan Foundation, chief consultant to the Theodore Roosevelt Center through Dickinson State University, and a columnist for the Bismarck Tribune. He has an MA from Oxford University, England, a BA in English Literature from Vanderbilt University, and a BA in English from the University of Minnesota. Please welcome Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And now it is my extraordinary privilege to be able to introduce our special guest today, Dr. William Foley, who is Professor Emeritus of History at the University of Central Missouri, who specializes in the histories of the American West and his native state, Missouri. He has authored or edited 7 books, including Wilderness Journey, The Life of William Clark, and that's what we're going to be talking about today, The First Chouteaus, The River Barons of Early St. Louis, The Genesis of Missouri, From Wilderness Outpost to Statehood, and A History of Missouri, 1673 to 1820. Bill's articles have appeared in the Western Historical Quarterly, Montana, the Magazine of Western History, the Missouri Historical Review, Kansas History, Gateway Heritage, We Proceed On, and various historical encyclopedia, dictionaries, and anthologies. His most recent essay, James Wilkinson, Zebulon Pike's Mentor, and Thomas Jefferson's Capricious Point Man in the West, was published earlier this year in Zebulon Pike, Thomas Jefferson, and the Opening of the American West from the University of Oklahoma Press. He is a member of the Missouri Historical Review's editorial board and was general editor of the University of Missouri Press's Missouri Biography series. He also served on the Missouri Advisory Council on Historical Preservation, the Missouri Historic Records Advisory Board, and the Friends of the Missouri State Archives Board of Directors. Dr. Foley has received the State Historical Society of Missouri's Distinguished Service Award, the Missouri Governor's Award for Teaching Excellence, the American Association for State and Local History's Award of Merit, the University of Central Missouri's Distinguished Service Award, the Baylor Distinguished Faculty Award, and writing awards from the State Historical Society of Missouri, Montana Historical Society, Missouri History Museum in St. Louis, Kansas State Historical Society. This is a long list, Dr. Foley.
Enough.
Okay. The Friends of Missouri State Archives annually offers the William E. Foley Research Fellowship to support scholarship using Missouri's public records. So please welcome Dr. Foley. And now I want to add a personal note. I was a young Air Force officer stationed in Missouri, and if I wanted to get my education, my graduate degree on the base, I could become a political scientist. Nothing against political scientists, but that's not what I wanted to do. I wanted to be a historian, so I had to go to the university itself. And so I got to the university, and I was very fortunate. Dr. Foley became my advisor and worked with me around a horrendous schedule as an active duty officer and strong-armed the other faculty so that we could make this happen. And as a result of that, I got my master's degree in history under Dr. Foley, and I'm very, very appreciative of that. And just to sort of connect the dots for you, because Dr. Foley was willing to work with me on my schedule, I ended up with a master's degree in history. Because of that, I ended up on the faculty at the Air Force Academy. Because of that, they sent me off for my PhD in history. And because of that, I get to be president of Bismarck State College today. And so connecting the dots is, it's all Dr. Foley's fault. That's connecting the dots. So I'm just delighted from a personal point of view, Dr. Foley, that you would come and be with us. We've had a marvelous couple days together.
We sure have.
This has been a great joy for me, a very, very personal joy as well as professional joy having Dr. Foley visit with us. So on that note, I think we ought to get right into the topic because there's so much, unless you wanted to jump in.
No.
You wanted to jump in?
I think you were going to say something.
Oh, okay.
I wanted to make sure, I told Larry before this started, I'm technologically challenged, and sure enough, my mic fell off, so I wanted to be sure
You're
I
fine.
got it
No,
where
you're
it's
fine.
supposed to be. Okay.
We're in good shape.
Well, we've had the
Go ahead.
greatest couple of days. On Thursday night, we had dinner, just the three of us, and we talked about Lewis and Clark endlessly. And then on Friday, you hosted a dinner for a number of people and a luncheon for your faculty, and that was tremendous. And then yesterday, we went for, if you can believe this, for 516 miles through western North Dakota to Minot, to Stanley, to Ross, to Tioga, to Williston, to north of Williston, to Watford City, to Alexander, down to Killdeer, to Dickinson and back. It was 516 miles. They're in the front seat. I'm in the back seat like their teenage son. And we talked endlessly, and we had, I want to show this picture. Here they are at the Theodore Roosevelt statue on the campus of Dickinson State University. The Roosevelt Center created that statue of the young Roosevelt at the age of 24. It's on the Stark County Courthouse lawn, and we had the chance towards the end of the day to see that. And go ahead.
It was just a delightful day, and the weather was perfect. You couldn't have made it better, but it was great to be back. I've been to North Dakota before. I must say things are changing in some of the areas we went through, but North Dakota is a state that I have a fondness for, and so it's a pleasure to be here today.
Because he hadn't been here for a while, we decided we would count the oil trucks, but we gave up at 622,000. So here they are. We went to this was my personal moment, I think yours too. We went to the place where Meriwether Lewis was shot in the buttocks by his own man, accidentally, on August 11th, 1806 on the return journey. And I've written about this extensively. You've written about this. They were on the return. Clark was on the Yellowstone. Lewis was on the Missouri. They would meet at the confluence. Some things went wrong, but they met soon thereafter. And Lewis was looking for these hills. It's at the Red Mike Hills where the golf course is up there, east of Williston on the north side. And we went to the Burnt Hills, as Lewis called them. And we went to the place, more or less, where this unfortunate accident occurred. And for me, it's like being at a shrine in some way.
It was wonderful, and I told Clay, I said, oh, if we could go there, and we went down a little dirt road, but it was marvelous.
Got my car dirty. I do want to point that out.
Larry did some fretting because we went off asphalt. But it's okay, Larry.
But it was worth it.
It was worth it.
Yeah,
It was well worth it.
he's trading the car tomorrow, but we survived. And this is actually a picture on the other side of Tobacco Garden Creek that the National Forest has put up. This is somewhat graphic, but Lewis was shot in the buttocks, and it was a .54 caliber ball, so far as we know. That's more than half an inch, and it went entirely through one cheek, and it grazed the other one to an inch in depth. And when Lewis was shot, he knew instantly that it was his own man, Pierre Cruzat, who was a great waterman and a fine violinist, but a poor in eyesight. He was actually blind in one eye and nearsighted in the other. So we might talk about why Lewis went hunting with a blind man. But Lewis, when he was shot, shouted out, "Damn you, you rascal, you have shot me." And this is a picture of presumably Clark, although it doesn't look like Clark, putting lint, and there was an elaborate way of draining the wound. And this is a picture of the burnt rock that's scoria or clinker, but that's why the Burnt Hills have their name. If you look towards the top, there's a thin layer of scoria or clinker on top, and that's why Lewis thought these should be called the Burnt Hills. They're called the Red Mike Hills today, and he wanted to get there because it was an Enlightenment event, and he wanted to ascertain the latitude and longitude of that place. If you think of the Missouri starting at Three Forks and arcing up, and then turning south in North Dakota, where it arcs up, at some point it gets as close to the North Pole as it's ever going to get. That's right here.
But I'll point out that Clark was the one that
Clark found it.
found it, and
Yes. It had to start already.
We have
That's it. Right into it. But this is the view from the other direction. That's a fracking rig just on the other end of that bluff. And so this is going to be a very interesting quarter century, let's say. But that's not our theme today.
That's not our theme. Can we go back to the beginning?
Which?
You want to go back? Okay. Well, first, another administrative note that I wanted to point out, and then we're going to get right into the conversation now, and that is that the core of what we're going to talk about today, and this is why this is so exciting, is Clay's recently published book, The Character of Meriwether Lewis, Explorer in the Wilderness, and Dr. Foley's book, The Wilderness Journey, The Life of William Clark. And Sarah is here from Fort Mandan, and just to let you know, these are for sale today too. So what we're going to do afterwards is the authors will be delighted to sit out back here if anybody would like to buy one of their books and to autograph it for you and to do all that sort of stuff. So we're going to do that.
And Larry, I actually have a schematic diagram of the relative importance of these two books. Okay. See if I can find it here. This is his book, of course. There's mine. If you only have $30, Wilderness Journey. This is one of the great scholars of our time. It's been such an honor to have you here. And my own little book is so heavily indebted to your big, important book. When this started, when the bicentennial started, and I want you to talk just quickly about this, there was no biography of Clark. There was the Steffens book, which was kind of an administrative study of his time after the expedition, but it brushed through the expedition in a chapter. So there was no biography of this extraordinary man, and 3 now exist, but yours is the great one.
As I worked through this period, and I kept thinking, we need a study of Clark, and I was reminded of there was a Far Side cartoon a number of years ago, and it's entitled Clark's Mother, and she's holding up a newspaper. Now, I have to say that this is not historically accurate because she was deceased before the expedition, but anyway, it makes a good story.
Way to wreck the joke. Go ahead, yeah.
She's holding up the paper and saying, here it is again, son, headlines. Lewis and Clark mission expedition a success. Always Lewis's name first and not yours. If you don't do something about this, you're going to play second fiddle in all the history books. So I decided, well, Mrs. Clark, I'll try to do justice by your son.
Excellent.
So we were talking about we should start off with sort of a biographical sketch of each one of them.
Now, this is Dr. Foley's other book that I'm so fond of, The Genesis of Missouri. You've written a bunch. They heard about that, the Chouteaus, and you're thinking about writing a second volume on the Chouteaus. But I have a series of questions, but let's start by just getting some facts on and off the table.
Yeah, let's just do a quick biographical sketch. Dr. Foley, why don't you, who is William Clark?
William
for
Clark,
our folks?
Born in Virginia in 1770, came from a family of lower gentry. They were landowners. They owned a limited number of slaves. That gave them at least a nodding acquaintance with the first families of Virginia. William Clark was the 9th of 10 children. His older brother, George Rogers Clark, whom we may talk a little bit about, was, of course, much better known in his day and time. The Clarks moved to Kentucky when William was 14. His older brothers had access to a much higher quality of education, tutors and schools. Kentucky was out on the edge of the frontier. Now the older boys, there was a big age gap between the children. So the older brothers stayed in Virginia, but the parents and the younger children joined George Rogers out in Kentucky. He was pretty much self-schooled. George Rogers was instrumental in that. But he was well schooled, but he had to do it pretty much on his own with the assistance of the family. Beyond that, he went into the military, joined the Army, was involved in the fighting in the West in the 1780s and 90s. Retired from the military, interestingly enough, because his brother's finances were in chaos. And he stepped down to try to help out George Rogers Clark, who had fallen on hard times, who had developed a drinking problem. And so he devoted his time to his brother. And I think one thing that's important about Clark is family was so important to him, both in terms of his own wives and children, his parents, his brothers. It was a close-knit family, and Clark was clearly a family man. Subsequently, as Clay will probably tell you, that he and Lewis first met when Clark was in the Army, and actually Lewis served under Clark. But then he resigned, and then subsequently, of course, was enlisted by Lewis to join the expedition. The only other thing I would say is that because Clark did live 68 years, he had a life after the expedition that was in many ways as important as the expedition was. He was governor of territorial Missouri. He was the U.S. Superintendent of Indian Affairs. He negotiated more Indian treaties than any other person in the history of the United States. So he had a rather remarkable career, but we'll talk more about that.
And when he died, it was the largest funeral ever in St. Louis.
St. Louis, huge turnout to honor him, and so it was quite an event.
Meriwether Lewis.
Well, it's just a study in contrast, and really one of the bases of this conversation, and one of the reasons that I think we appreciate each other's point of view is that Stephen Ambrose in Undaunted Courage and in his lectures used to say Lewis and Clark were the best friends in American history, and that their relationship was filled with unending harmony, and there could not have been a better match, and so on and so forth. And all of that is true up to a point. But their lives are quite distinct in some really important ways. Lewis was born in Virginia in 1774. That is, he's 4 years younger than Clark. He was born within sight of Monticello. Lewis's father died when Lewis was just 4 years old. His mother soon remarried and moved Lewis and his siblings down to Georgia. Lewis never really had a father, therefore. Jefferson never had a son. Jefferson and Lewis had a kind of a father-son relationship in some respects, and Lewis had appealed to Jefferson as a young man of about 18 to go on a mission much like the one he eventually took. Jefferson thought he was too young and inexperienced at the time, and that didn't work out. But when Lewis had a career in the Army. He was involved in the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion. But by the time Jefferson became president in February of 1801, Jefferson knew of Lewis and thought well of him and probably was thinking about what became the mission. And he hired Lewis to be his private correspondence secretary. And Lewis lived in the White House with Jefferson for more than 2 years before he undertook the journey. Those must have been some 2 years to be the secretary to this member of the American Philosophical Society and America's greatest figure of the Enlightenment. And Jefferson had all of his life wanted to get a mission up the Missouri River. And here was a young man now who might be able to fulfill it. Lewis then chose Clark to be his partner in discovery. They made the expedition. And then when they come back, we'll talk about the expedition in greater detail, but when they come back, their lives begin to diverge in a really remarkable way. Clark comes back and almost immediately marries. Lewis never does, although he proposes and courts several women. Clark immediately has children, 7 altogether over time. Lewis has no children. Clark begins to accumulate property. becomes a prosperous merchant, is a figure in the town. Lewis never does. He's always a marginal figure. Clark succeeds at all of the offices to which he's appointed. Jefferson gives Lewis the governorship of Upper Louisiana, and Clark is the superintendent of Indian Affairs. Clark flourishes, Lewis doesn't. In every possible way, you would think that when they came back, they would have parallel lives, but they don't. Lewis stalls, Clark flourishes. This had to be really hard on Lewis. It's like a mirror being held up to Lewis. Here's my closest friend, my partner. His life is on track. I can't get my life on track. What's that about? In 1809, Lewis dies violently, almost certainly by suicide. Clark lives on for several more decades and flourishes through the rest of a long and distinguished life. And the irony of ironies is that Lewis is the Enlightenment figure, the writer, the president's pal. He never publishes his book. Clark never expected to have to publish this book, but when Lewis dies, Jefferson says to Clark, "We'll handle this." And Clark has to go to Philadelphia, and he literally doesn't know the disposition of the project. He knows the publisher, but he doesn't know who's making illustrations, who's handling the scientific materials, who's handling the latitude and longitude. He has to go around and say, "What do you know about this thing?" And so he pulls it together and works with the ghostwriter, Nicholas Biddle, so that the first edition of the Journals of Lewis and Clark, as a paraphrase narrative, comes out in 1814, thanks to Clark, because at the time of Lewis's death, that project was in collapse. And so it's a sad divergence. I'll let you pick it up from there.
Yes, and it really was a burden for Clark because he didn't feel that he was properly equipped to tackle this, and yet it was so important. Jefferson thought it was the whole rationale for the expedition, for the scientific information, to make it accessible and available. And so it sort of falls into Clark's lap here, and as Clay says, he's pretty much in the dark about what's transpired up to this point. But Clark is one that attempts to do his duty, whatever that might be, and so he picks it up and proceeds on.
And back to Stephen Ambrose's point, it seems absolutely clear that Clark admired and even loved Lewis. He names his first son Meriwether Lewis Clark. Talk a little bit about that admiration.
Yes, he did, and they were close, but as Clay said, when the expedition was over, Clark sort of moves on, he marries. There's a kind of an interesting thing that happens when Clark brings his wife, who was 16, he was 37, so there was a 21-year difference in their ages. He brings her to St. Louis along with one of his nieces, so that the 16-year-old bride will have at least someone that she knows. But they're making their way to St. Louis, and Lewis had arrived there a short time before, and so he goes out and writes and says, "I've rented a house for us to stay in." Well, that doesn't work out. Here's this this married couple, and Clark or Lewis is just sort of there, and eventually they go their separate ways. But you have the feeling that Lewis senses what we're going to do is just sort of pick up where we left off. We spent all this time together on the trail, and we'll be messmates and so on. And although Clark was devoted and thought highly of Lewis, he still was building another life now. And that's one of the I think, contradictions here and one of the issues.
So Lewis writes this letter and he says, "Can't wait for you to get here with your new bride. I've rented this big house. We'll all live together." And he said, "If that doesn't work out, I'll take an apartment somewhere else, but we'll still do all our meals together." And Clark's wife probably thought, they're newlyweds. They're in the honeymoon phase of their life. Lewis is an odd duck anyway. And she probably felt no. And Clark probably felt no. That's not really the way to start a marriage together to have this strange mercurial genius hanging around all the time. And so that's when the things really began to move separately.
Okay, we've gotten to the end here. Why don't we go back to the beginning with the whole journey? I don't know if we need to do a 101 or if you've got a map. Yeah, okay, so we can kind of do the 101 on Lewis and Clark, make sure everybody here is up to speed, and I'm sure most folks here are. And just go over that quickly, and then let's get, I know you've got some very specific questions that you wanted to engage Dr. Foley on. So.
Well, let's just start. The journey formal is May 14th, 1804 to September 23rd, 1806, from St. Charles, Missouri, all the way to the Pacific Ocean and back. They wintered 3 times, one at the mouth of Wood River near St. Louis between November and May of 1803-4. Then they wintered here, as everyone knows, between October 26th and April 7th, 1804-1805, and they wintered on the Pacific coast between November 20th of 1805 to March 23rd of 1806. So 3 winter compounds, 7,689 miles, and they lost just one of their men, Charles Floyd, of natural causes early on in the expedition. So you pick it up from there.
As they were getting ready to outfit the expedition, of course, Lewis had handled many of the arrangements and getting the supplies in the east and so on. But when they arrive, come down the Ohio and arrive at the Mississippi, the Spaniards, who are still in control of St. Louis and the territory west, say, no, you can't cross the river. So they had to set up a camp at Wood River, which was just across from St. Louis on the Illinois side. And so they're preparing and sort of getting people ready for the expedition. And it's Clark who stays there. Lewis heads off to St. Louis. Now, I think this has a significant impact because in this early stage, these men are bonding with Clark. He's the one, and he's not as officious, and he's more easygoing than Lewis would be. And so they come to have a considerable respect for Clark, and they tend to look to him. And I think that's important in terms of the relationship. It's not to say there was any kind of antagonism, but it's just they know Clark, and he's kind of their kind of guy, even though he is their officer and he's in command. And so that's important in terms of the early operations of the expedition.
During this mustering phase, Lewis is only at Camp Wood, which is where they're gathering their men and training their men and disciplining their men and assigning tasks and discovering who's a natural hunter and who's a blacksmith and who can do this and who can do that. I mean, this is a shakedown. They're just taking raw recruits and trying to decide who is going to be the best boatman and who's going to play the violin and who's going to be the best marksman. Lewis is gone for all but 35 days during that winter, and Clark is there 105 days. So they're really Clark's team when they leave in May. Lewis is sort of this commander who's gone most of the time, and when he's there, he's not very pleasant. He's a hard disciplinarian, he's kind of a prig, and he's hard on the men, and he's officious. And Clark is much more genial, and he's there. And so imagine the first impression is so important. The men are really Clark's men, and Lewis is just sort of a supernumerary or something at this point.
Does Lewis ever get over that on the journey of being the odd man out, or is that why we see him so much gone from the journey itself?
The irony of this is Lewis's expedition. He's the one that Jefferson has chosen to tackle this project, and he brought Clark on to assist. But there's an irony there in terms of this juxtaposition that they're bonding with Clark more than they are with Lewis. But it was clear that Lewis was the commander and was in charge.
So he's not really odd man out then?
No, well, he's just they just like Clark better than they like Lewis, I think.
Okay. All right. Now, you've got some very specific questions.
Well, here's we've already said this, but
Okay.
family man, duty. Just give the adjectives that you would use to describe Clark.
Okay. Family man, duty, committed to his country, patriotic, works hard, does his job, is successful at most things that he undertakes. Just the kind of person that I think one would like to have in an organization or whatever. He's not full of himself. He's rather modest, but he goes about tackling the jobs that are given to him, and for the most part does them. Stable. Grounded.
Pragmatic. You know.
Okay, but on this point, let's just bring this up very quickly because we're sort of talking about the character of William Clark here before we get into Lewis, but talk a little bit about him as a slave holder. I was fascinated by your discussion about him owning slaves and how he treated them.
That's when you work with someone, do a biography, and Clay could testify, you get so involved with the person and so on. And it can be either a sort of a love or a hate relationship. Sometimes, you get someone you really admire, or sometimes biographers find somebody they just can't stand, or someplace in between. But the more I got into Clark, the more I found that there was to admire. The way he dealt with his family, the way he was always available to those who needed him. And he owned slaves, and that was a part of the time and culture. But then the disappointment comes when one sees that here is a man who was kind and indulgent to his children and really would do just about anything for them that he could. And yet, in terms of his slaves, he viewed them in such a different context. They were his property. York, about whom much has been made, his servant, they grew up together. They were about the same age. York had belonged to the family. They grew up, and when the elder John Clark Williams' father died, William Clark inherited York. But here they are, they've grown up together, they know one another. He accompanies Clark when he's in the military, even before the expedition, but it was just logical that he would go along. And he goes along, and a great deal has been made about his role in the expedition and so on. York had a wife, and through some letters that Jim Holmberg discovered in private correspondence, we discovered that when they returned to St. Louis after the expedition, and Clark is posted there to be the commander of the militia and the Indian agent, he insists that York stay with him in St. Louis. Well, York has a wife back in Louisville, and I don't know we don't know if there were children, but he naturally is not too pleased about this. And Clark is really put out that York would even raise this kind of question. And this is just one example. I think Clark viewed him primarily as property and an investment and money, and it was sort of as if in his mind, once he has done what he can do to assist me, then when he becomes old, I'll probably free him and let him go his own way. And his other slaves as well. He whipped a pregnant slave. Well, there's no way that one can justify that, even in the context. The past is a different place, as I used to tell my students. But that's the one thing about William Clark that is very difficult, and I wouldn't say puzzling, but disappointing, I think is what I want to say.
And there's this great moment where Clark becomes so exasperated
Yes.
with York that what? He's going to sell him.
He's going to sell him, and Lewis says,
No.
no, I don't think you want to.
Lewis actually steps in and
Yeah.
is the more humane
Humane
on that
on
one
that
question.
one question.
Because Clark, I think his word is thrashes
Yes.
York and says, I knocked the stuffing out of him, or I brought him from his uppityness down to a better state of mind. And it reveals a side of the Virginia-Kentucky white character that is not admirable, but he's by no means unique in this.
No.
Yeah. Not to dig too deeply into this, but this is an issue, I think, in American history when we're dealing with people like Thomas Jefferson. We've got the same issue, right? Slavery is really a black spot in American history that we cannot justify under any terms. So we've got William Clark, who has all these admirable qualities. We've got Thomas Jefferson, who has all these admirable qualities, and yet they own people. And so it really, it's in the conscience of America, and I don't think we just brush over it. I think we have to admit that there was something really deep and evil within the American Republic that would allow that institution.
Well, even if you remove the terms of judgment, evil and so on, the fact is that York was on this journey, and you know this better than I, he was allowed to have a rifle, and he hunted, and he was often alone. And he was prized by many Indian tribes because he was so exotic. Most of them had never seen a Negro, and they were fascinated, and they assumed that he might be the special one because he was the one that was unusual, different from the rest. And so the women were attracted to him, and leaders were wanting to know more about him and puzzled over him. And he had this extraordinary run between May of 1804 and September of 1806, and then he comes back and he sort of says to Clark, I'm kind of more than a slave now, given what I've been through. I think you should allow me at least to go back and be with my family. And Clark says, no, you're a slave. And so talk a little bit, Clark should have at that point said, well, of course.
Yes, and the thing that is so disappointing is that in his relationships with other people, Clark was generous and understanding and considerate. I mean, that was just who he was. And yet here in this case, and I must say that the more I got into this, I was kind of surprised, and I kept saying, oh, no, this can't be. But it was. And there's some mystery as to whether he eventually freed him. Yes.
How do you come down on that?
I think he did. He was eventually freed. He went back to Kentucky in part because he was just so unhappy, and Clark thought he was being too difficult to control, and so they said, well, send him back to the family in Kentucky and maybe it'll be better. Eventually, although the evidence is not entirely clear, I think he was freed, but he died very shortly thereafter of some disease, I think. So it's a sad story.
You want to go on?
Yep, we've got some more questions.
So how did Clark come to be recruited for the expedition? It's clearly Lewis's expedition, and Jefferson chose Lewis.
I think Lewis had gotten to know Clark when he served under him. Lewis also was involved in a court-martial, and that was part of the reason that he was reassigned to Clark's command. But I think they established a kind of a relationship. They did like one another. There's no question about that. And I think Lewis recognized that here's a very stable person and somebody you can count on and somebody that can get the job done. And he has the skills that this kind of thing will require. So he's the kind of person that I need to join me in this.
And Lewis offers Clark, having consulted Jefferson, a co-captaincy that's not brevet, it's a permanent co-captaincy, and he will be a partner in discovery in every possible way. How'd that turn out?
It didn't turn out very well because the military rules and so on, that was just not possible. They were reducing the size of the military, and there were a limited number of slots open, and there weren't any more left. And so the letter arrives with Clark's commission, but it's not for a captain, it's for a lieutenant. And then Lewis has to go out and tell him this. And it was not good news to Clark. But he took it, he chose not to make a big issue. Lewis said, we're not going to tell the men, we're going to be captains, and that was the way he was viewed on the expedition, as they were co-captains, and they called him Captain Clark. So the men weren't aware that this had happened, but it was it came as a
But it's a
shock.
character moment, because some people in that position would have walked away from the expedition. Clark was upset about it, and he later made it clear that he was upset about it, but he swallowed his pride and he did it. I mean, that's an extraordinary thing, isn't it?
Exactly. And that's who, again, that's kind of who Clark was, I think.
Let's go back to the court-martial. You kind of glossed over that quickly. So he's court-martialed for...
Lewis is, yeah.
Lewis is court-martialed for...
He was involved in what's known as an affair of honor with a man named Elliot, and it was in the Army, and Lewis, we don't know all the details, but Lewis felt, he went to a party at Elliot's quarters, and Lewis was apparently offensive somehow, and Elliot told him to leave. And Lewis regarded that as a profound act of disrespect. So he left for a while, and then he came back and challenged this Elliot to a duel. And things could have ratcheted up into a duel, but it didn't happen. And Lewis was then court-martialed for this. Elliot filed charges for behavior unbecoming to an officer, and the court-martial was held. Lewis handled his own defense. He was acquitted. But he was in Mad Anthony Wayne's companies, and Wayne didn't like this sort of thing, and so he had Lewis reassigned with some shame. Lewis has been exonerated legally, but there's some cloud now hanging over his head, and he's reassigned to none other than William Clark and a chosen rifle company. And so what would you say Clark's initial sense of Lewis must have been?
Here's a guy that can sort of go off. And Clay, and we'll probably get into this a little bit later, I think one of the insights that Clay really brings in his study of Lewis is how important that Clark was as kind of a stabilizing force for Lewis. And maybe if Clark had been there, maybe this whole thing, this court-martial wouldn't have, he'd have just said, just go away and cool off, Meriwether.
Well, in fact, he did prevent a duel later.
Duel later, exactly. Where again, Lewis was about to get involved in a duel with Frederick Bates, and Clark plays the mediator and sort of says, no, we don't want to go there. And so that's something we'll probably look at.
Probably saving Frederick Bates' life.
Yes.
Because Lewis is an extraordinary...
And just to help everybody out here, Frederick Bates was...
He was the secretary of the territory, a territorial official, served directly under Lewis, who was the governor at the time.
This is after the expedition.
This is after the expedition. This is back in St. Louis.
But here, Lewis wants to challenge Bates to a duel.
His own secretary.
Because Bates has publicly, in Lewis's mind, Bates has publicly shown disrespect to Lewis. Same old story. And he goes to Clark and says, you're my second. That's how this worked. And then Clark stalls. And then Bates says, I don't trust you because you, traveled up and
down the river with him. And you're
But he manages to stall it long enough until they get over it. But if Lewis had met Bates, unless Bates had a good day, Bates is going to be a dead man. Lewis is an incredible marksman. So, but Clark, duels are common. Hamilton dies in a duel. Andrew Jackson fights duels. There are duels everywhere, but Clark is way too level-headed to let his closest friend get involved in a duel with his secretary. But again, it's Clark who prevents that.
Okay, I don't know how we're doing on time.
How important was Clark to the success of the expedition?
Well, I think he was important. He was the cartographer. His maps were just marvelous and a great achievement of the expedition. He was the best waterman in terms of maneuvering the boats. When they had difficult places to go in the rivers and over rapids and so on. Clark was the one that was there in the boats and taking charge. He was, as we said earlier, he was the one that the men sort of looked to in terms of the day-to-day kind of things that were going on. He wasn't the scientist or the intellect or the literary person that Lewis was, but he was the one that just sort of kept things moving ahead.
And if Lewis had not chosen Clark, it would have been quite a different journey.
It would have been, I think. Who knows? It probably might have succeeded, but there might have been more tempestuous. It wouldn't have been perhaps as placid as it. That's not to say there weren't disagreements and arguments and so on.
What was the precise relationship of responsibilities and achievements between Lewis and Clark? You said Clark was the map maker and Clark handled the boats.
And he sort of managed when they had to build the canoes and dig them out. We were up at the museum up at Fort Mandan on Friday, and see those big cottonwoods that they hewed out, and Clark's the one that superintends most of that. And even when Meriwether Lewis gets this cockamamie scheme for this iron boat that he's gonna make, and I'll let Clay talk about that. But anyway, Clark just sort of says, "Oh, okay, I don't think this is going to work," but and it didn't. But
let's hear about that cockamamie.
Well, the only thing I want to just talk about only insofar as it reflects their character. So Lewis has this idea as a good Enlightenment guy that at some point they're going to get to a place where the boats have to go over the mountains or around a big impediment of some sort. And so he has this iron frame built at Harper's Ferry that collapses into a canvas bag. It's 210 pounds. And there's iron pieces that you can then reconstruct in the wilderness. And then you kill a lot of elk and spread their peltries across the frame and shrink them. And now you have a portable boat. I mean, it actually is a very smart idea. And it only weighs 210 pounds. The problem is that they get out to the Great Falls where they first need the boat, and Lewis then sends about half the men out to start killing elk and doing all this stuff. And Clark is saying, I'm not sure this is going to work, and we could just go use trees. But Lewis says, no, that's not what the Enlightenment is about. And so Clark is sort of thinking, yeah, okay. And so they waste a month building this boat.
And then it leaks.
And then Lewis forgot one thing. He didn't bring any sealant. And so they have 39 elk skins sewn together like a quilt, but nothing to seal the seams. So Lewis sends men out, and they come back with pine tar, and he uses beeswax and all this stuff, and he puts it in the water, and it is beautiful, 45 feet long. And Lewis said, and he has this great literary flair that Clark doesn't have, and he says, it floated like a perfect cork in the water. And an hour later it sank. and so Lewis has it drawn out, and they take it apart. And then Clark shows a kind of miffed, kind of upset in his journal, and says, well, I sent men out to make the boats, which he could have done a month earlier. Yeah. So there are these moments. You have to talk about that, how as a historian, they're not revealing when they're upset.
No. And Clark was, and they were military officers and so on, so he's not going to express himself, and even Lewis, he just sort of holds it in and goes on and does his thing, and I'm sure, I think that's one point that Clay makes so effectively. Stephen Ambrose's book was wonderful in terms of it generated tremendous interest and made people aware, and so. But you have this sort of the perfect duo, and it wasn't quite always that. I mean, they're human beings, and they get a little bit disgruntled with one another, and that's a part of it too. But
I
Clark.
can't help. Okay, round two. Has Clark received his due from historians of the expedition?
More recently, I think so. Yes, I mean, I think it's generally some of the things that I've indicated that he did. I think he does get credit for that, and so yes, I think so.
And of course, you've played a role in that.
Yeah.
But during the bicentennial, 3 studies of Clark are published.
Yes.
And you could make the argument that the bicentennial was really Clark's moment, that he got the lion's share of national attention, and his reputation grew, and he became much more central to the story during the bicentennial than he had ever been previously.
That was, my book came out, Lanny Jones's book, Jay Buckley. The Clark letters fortuitously were discovered in an attic in Louisville, letters that he'd written to his brother, his oldest brother, Jonathan, which revealed a lot of information that we didn't have, including some of the stuff on his relationship with York. So Clark's mother would be approving of what happened during the bicentennial. And one of the things when I started this that sort of concerned me, and I think that's been rectified and then some, but that Clark in his early life lived under the shadow of his brother George Rogers Clark, and then for a long time it was Lewis and Clark, and he was kind of, but now that I think has been addressed. And that paves the way then to move to the next phase, which is, I think, trying to come to terms with a more nuanced understanding and appreciation of what each of them meant and what each of them accomplished. And that's one of the things that Clay's book is so important. I wish I'd had Clay's book when I wrote mine, because as I read that, I thought, why didn't I think of that, you know? But now we're moving beyond, and we're moving to really what was the nature of.
Well, that's so generous of you to say, but there's a paradox in this, because before the bicentennial, Clark was less celebrated.
Yes.
But he was seen in almost an entirely positive light.
Yes.
And when I read your book, or Landon Jones' book, or Jay Buckley's book, Clark lived for a long time after the expedition. And when you start to look at him after the expedition, even if you understand the cultural context of this, you begin to lose some respect for him. The shabby way he treated York and other slaves, his role in dispossessing Indians in the lower Missouri country. In other words, before this had not been attended to very much. Thanks to you and others, suddenly you have no choice, because there are decades of Clark after the expedition. And when you look at that, you must have felt this as a writer, that kind of a little sadness to be exposing him as an agent of dispossession.
And that's the other issue, and one that really was difficult for him, that he had to wrestle with in terms of how to come to terms with this. Because of his ongoing encounters with Native American peoples, and they viewed him with a certain amount of, in a much more positive way than they did many white officials. They called him the red-headed chief and so on. And Clark, again, he has this being, this ability to sort of understand and empathize that he didn't show with York, but he did with Native peoples. And he writes a letter, but he's an official, and he's charged with carrying out government policies. And government policies at that time are dispossession, removal, negotiating land treaties that would convey the land to the U.S., and Clark is charged with carrying that out. The more he deals with this and the more he comes to know. Now, Clark grew up in Kentucky, which was called The Bloody Ground, and it was violent and so on. He writes a letter in 1826 to the Secretary of War, Barber, and he said, you know, once upon a time, the Indians were cruel and vicious and difficult and so on, and now they are to be pitied, and their situation has been so changed, and we must somehow figure out how to deal with these people. Now, it still meant there was a price for his sympathy. You've got to convey your land, but beyond that, we should be more concerned about their plight, about their situation, and it's a dilemma that he had to struggle with, I think, a lot. Because he came, you know, he worked with these people. He knew them. They came to his Indian superintendent. They came to his office to discuss or to give their complaints, and he could see firsthand, look, some of these people are starving, and we put them in a terrible position.
And he had an Indian museum. And on the expedition, he was the go-to guy for Indians. He liked Indians, he tolerated Indians, he understood Indians. Lewis was very uptight about Indians, and Clark was this extraordinary negotiator.
Yeah, he was the diplomat. He was the one. That's another of the things that on the expedition. And so he brings that with him back to his duties as Indian agent, but still the official policy of the government, he has to carry that out. That's his job, and it is get them to surrender their lands.
And as you said, 10% of all treaties ever
created. I mean, he negotiated more treaties with native peoples than any other person in the history.
And these were all treaties of dispossession.
So as an agent for the United States, he is saying, this is my duty, this is what I've got to do. But by the 1820s, he sees that this disposition of the lands has created something he's very compassionate about now, is it's put the Indians in a very...
And he doesn't say, well, no, we can't do this. I think he understands, and in some ways, one of the legacies of Lewis and Clark and so on is the beginning of the planting of seeds of American expansion into this great area that they have visited, and even his map, this master map of the West that he drew. He didn't put any boundaries out here. Well, this is the British, and this is this. I mean, already it's sort of looking towards an American occupation of that area, but that requires dispossession because these lands are inhabited.
And would it be fair to say he would do anything to prevent the British from growing from Canada down?
Yes, yes. He didn't have a very fond view of the British. In part, all of his older brothers had served in the Revolutionary Army, and one of his brothers, John, a couple of them were taken as prisoners during the war, but one of his brothers, John, was held on a prison ship in New Jersey, and he developed consumption while he was there. And he came back and he lived for a little while, but he never recovered, and he died at a very young age. And I think the British were responsible for that.
How did Clark react to Lewis's premature death in 1809?
He thought he had committed suicide. There was really no doubt, and of course the ongoing debate about murder versus suicide. Clay and I have talked a good deal about this, but the fact that the two people who probably knew Lewis as well as anyone, Jefferson and Clark, both thought that indeed he had committed suicide, and it was a great shock and a great concern, and there were some letters that he wrote. Do you have? Okay.
But the point I think we agree on is that both Jefferson and Clark were shocked but not surprised when they heard the news.
No.
That it's a horrible thing to hear, but neither of them said, he's not the type that could do that.
And there's a school of thought out there, just for everybody, that says that Lewis was murdered at the inn that he was staying at.
On the Natchez Trace.
But the two of you are in complete agreement that it was suicide, and Clark and Jefferson would have agreed with you as well.
I can't believe that, and I think Clay would show this as far as Clark, and I think the same would be true. If they really thought he'd been murdered, they would have said, well, let's investigate. Let's send someone out to find out who did the deed. And
You've said what Clark did after the expedition, and Indian policy on Clark and York. Here are the propositions. Number one, hiring Clark was the best thing Lewis ever did, right?
I would think so, but maybe there's but they did make a good team. They really did, and they complemented one another. And Lewis had certain strengths and abilities and so on that Clark didn't have. There were some things that Clark could not have done that Lewis did do.
Latitude and longitude.
Latitude and longitude.
Let me, on this point, if I can,
Sure.
and just to say this and then have both of you sort of respond to it if you would. But it seems to me that within the matching of Lewis and Clark, that each one of them knew their own weaknesses, and the other complemented those weaknesses by shoring them up. So for example, Clark is very almost embarrassed about the way he writes, his literary abilities, his spelling. He just doesn't believe that he has any of this capacity, and he doesn't have the scientific background that Lewis had. And so Lewis knows, okay, I can take care of all that sort of stuff, but when it comes to making the canoes and working with the men and moving forward, I don't have, Lewis would say he didn't have the capability to do that. And so there's almost a perfect complement here in that each one of the weakness of each one of them, you can find the strength of the other one that they come together.
And one thing that I should have said before about in terms of Lewis's contributions, Lewis kept the journals all the way through. Now he had practiced, he kept journals when he was in the Army, and to my delight, I remember discovering these earlier, and I thought, okay. Or Clark. Lewis did not, there were periods when he didn't write, and Clay will talk about
lost his microphone.
So wait a minute, let me clarify. You're saying that Clark was a great journal record keeper.
Yeah. Did I say Lewis?
You said Lewis, yeah.
No. Clark was.
I'll get it for you.
So Clark, earlier in his Army experience, had already learned to keep good field notes and journals, and he was a great correspondent. He kept his vouchers. He got his detailed expense vouchers in at a timely fashion. He was incredibly responsible as a record keeper and as a correspondent and as a journal keeper all of his life. Clark.
Yeah.
And Lewis was not.
But when you read the journals, when Lewis did write, he wrote beautifully and eloquently in a way that Clark could not, in terms of describing the scene at the Great Falls or whatever. So the times he did write, he wrote grandly, but we have the full view thanks to Clark, because day by day, didn't always write it immediately. There's some question about when the journals, but he was steady enough that he had a record so we can follow the expedition throughout.
And do you think that, I mean, it looks to me like they came to some sort of at least tacit agreement early on, that Clark would be the default journal keeper and Lewis would try also, but if Lewis didn't, he knew that Clark would.
Yeah. And I think that was part of it.
We're just having problems.
I'm talking with my hands too.
All right.
Pull the cord a little, Larry. It might be that.
There we go.
But say that again.
So that, I lost the train of my thought here, that Clark kept the daily logs, and I think Lewis recognized, okay, Clark's doing this so I don't have to. If I want to do something else or whatever I'm concerned with, if I'm collecting plants or recording things, he knew that if the day went by and he hadn't written a line, Clark had, and so, because Jefferson had charged them to keep these journals and records, and so, again, he could depend on and rely on Clark to.
I think, Larry, we want to make sure we leave time for questions,
Yes.
so I don't know where we are.
Yeah.
We're good.
Okay, so here's a proposition. When Clark was not at Lewis's side, bad things tended to happen to Lewis. Do you agree?
Yes, and that's a point that Clay makes in his book, and I think it's absolutely true. As we said earlier, too bad he wasn't there when he got involved in that imbroglio that led to the first court-martial.
Or the shooting accident.
Or the shooting accident when Lewis got shot in the rear end. I think he'd have said, wait a minute, you're going to send this one-eyed guy out here and give him a gun and go out and hunt, and we're wandering around. Not a very good idea, probably. We've got better hunters on this crew that could do that. And so at so many points, as Clay can talk about, when Lewis seems to be at his worst is when Clark is away. And
just two I want you to talk about. One is the encounter with the Blackfeet. So they split up in Missoula. Lewis goes up to the northern part of Montana. Clark goes back on the Yellowstone. They're going to meet at the confluence sometime later that fall. Clark has a perfectly lovely, almost vacation on the Yellowstone with Sacagawea and York and
finds Pompey's Pillar, and
yeah, it's just a great time. Buffalo every night. Lewis has an ordeal up on the Upper Marias near the eastern portal of what's now Glacier National Park, and he has this encounter. Lewis plus 3 of his men with 8 young Blackfeet, and something happens at dawn, and there's a melee and a skirmish, and they wind up killing two Blackfeet. Reuben Fields kills one with a knife, and Lewis shoots the other one with his rifle. Talk a little bit about that. If Clark had been around, how do you see that looking?
Probably would not have happened. There's no way to know for sure, but Clark, in the terms of the way he approached Indians and dealt with these situations, he was trying to avoid this kind of confrontation and to find ways, and that's why he was, I think, the superior diplomat, because he did try to negotiate rather than to confront. And his view of native peoples, I think, was a little bit different than Lewis's, and probably got him into trouble when, of course, this was the only time when native peoples were killed as a result, most of them.
Isn't it the only violent confrontation on the
the
whole
whole
expedition? And
Depending
Lewis caused it.
Well,
Depending on what you mean by violent.
Yeah.
You know, Lewis slaps a Nez Perce, and
Perce.
there is some minor violence, but, and I don't think it's fair to say that Lewis caused it.
No.
But Lewis didn't have the skill set that could have prevented it.
that could have backed away
Yeah,
and
yeah.
kind of, or figured out a way.
I mean, Lewis
to
said they were
negotiate.
fighting in self-defense, and
Yeah.
they probably were, but if
but-
Clark had been there, he probably, first of all, would have said, we're not going up into this territory with just 3 men. Take 5, take 6. I think Lewis, that was one of the worst decisions Lewis ever made. He knew the Blackfeet territory was trouble. For some reason, he knew the Blackfeet were going to be hostile. He says so. And so he takes just 3 men. If they'd had 5, I don't think those Blackfeet would have dared do what they did. And so Lewis makes, I think, a bad decision as a commander. But then when he gets there, and this is where James Rhonda comes in. Rhonda says, Lewis is huffing and puffing about the white father in Washington and talking about their new relationship with the Shoshone. He's actually saying things that the Blackfeet find threatening, that we're going to be arming your traditional enemy, the Shoshone, and we've already negotiated with them, and we want you to trade with us, not with Canada. And you know, Lewis said things that Clark probably would have said, let's handle this a little more
Diplomatic.
quietly, or let's not make a big thing out of it. So there's one. The other one is, it's heartbreaking, Bill, because when Lewis dies on October 11th, 1809, he's at this little hotel, this little hostelry on the Natchez Trace, and according to Mrs. Grinder, the woman who is the closest thing we have to an eyewitness, one of the things he said before he died was, Clark is behind, he's coming on, and he'll make things right. And Clark was nowhere near this, but I mean, I think it's hard to say because it's counterfactual history, but if Clark had been there with Lewis, I very much doubt that Lewis would have taken his own life. What do you think?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely correct. I think he would have, and he would have been someone that could have interceded and recognized the fragility of Lewis's state of mind at that particular point. And he was under a lot of pressures from that led him to that. But and I've often thought, I know Clark was concerned and dismayed and so on, and about what had happened, and I suspect in his own mind he really thought, you know, as often happens with suicide and so on, what should I have done or what could I have done to have kept this, you know, from happening?
And if he had been there, surely he would have limited Lewis's intake of alcohol, would have kept powder away from him, would have stayed up through the night with him while he was raving or in dementia or whatever he was.
On this point, I think, don't you have the letter? Let's
look at that.
Let's jump to the letter.
But that goes back to the first point. That hiring Clark was a really, really smart thing, but Lewis couldn't always be with Clark, and especially there at the last gasp. Leave those for the moment. So this is the letter that Clark writes in early September 1809. Lewis is in trouble with the War Department. His personal finances are in disarray. He's in an open quarrel with his lieutenant, his secretary, Frederick Bates. People in the territory are unhappy with him, and there's some thought of a recall, that the government might actually recall Lewis or not reappoint him. Is that a fair assessment? And so then Clark, you read the letter. It's a marvelous letter that Clark writes to his brother Jonathan.
He says, I have not spent such a day as yesterday for many years. Took my leave of Governor Lewis, who set out to Philadelphia to write our book, but more particularly to explain some matter between him and the government. Several of his bills have distressed him much, which he expressed to me in such terms as to cause a sympathy. Note how he spelled sympathy.
It's lovely, isn't it?
Which is not yet off. I do not believe there was ever an honester man in Louisiana, nor one who had purer motives than Governor Lewis. If his mind had been at ease, I should have parted cheerfully. So he was really concerned about Lewis's state of mind and the fact that he was wrongly being accused and so on. But I don't think he, in retrospect, as he thinks about that, then he thinks, you know, it's...
But imagine that scene. So Lewis is going off to Washington to explain himself. He hasn't sent in the vouchers. He hasn't been corresponding. He doesn't even know where the receipts are. He's upset. He's terribly upset. He's probably ill. He had malaria. He's drinking heavily during this period. Clark comes in to help Lewis get ready to go off on this journey, and I can imagine him trying to help Lewis get his papers in order, and what are you going to say about this, and how are you going to handle that? And the portrait here is of an emotional wreck, isn't it?
Yeah. And again, that's why I think that when the news came, it was, you know, he's thinking back and you know.
So that very last line is intriguing.
Yeah.
If his mind had been at ease, I should have parted cheerfully.
So in other words, they didn't part cheerfully. Is there any record of the actual parting of Lewis from St. Louis?
This is it.
No. And I don't know, I don't think it meant that they were at odds, but I think he was just
terribly worried.
Sad.
And it's just heartbreaking to, you know, cause a sympathy which is not yet off. I mean, he's basically saying, I feel heartbroken for this, what's happening to my friend Lewis, and I can't help him anymore. I did what I could, and he wasn't even cheerful when we parted. He had this foreboding and anger and rage. And then, so let's look at the other letter. After the suicide or the death, this is, go ahead.
Yeah. I wish much to get the letter I received of Governor Lewis from New Madrid, which you saw. It will be of great service to me. Pray send it to Fincastle as soon as possible.
So explain that.
Well, we think that Lewis had sent this letter in which there were probably hints of what was maybe going to happen, that of his state of mind and so on. This letter has disappeared. We don't have it, so we don't know.
Excuse me, sir. This is written to his
Jonathan.
brother.
Jonathan. This is
After
to his
the
brother
news.
Jonathan after the news has come. And so he's really wishing, he had that letter, and I think we don't know what's in it for sure, but sort of surmise that he's sort of thinking back retrospectively in terms of what was in that letter was sending signals that maybe he failed to pick up on.
And now they
And
suddenly
now
fall
it's
into
suddenly,
place.
okay, yeah, which then adds to, well, yeah, sadly, I think he did the deed.
But that letter, Lewis's suicide
Suicide
letter,
letter, yeah.
or whatever it
Whatever.
was, has disappeared. Why has it disappeared?
I wish I knew, I don't know.
As a Clark biographer, what's your best read?
Well, I don't know. This doesn't hint that he has it, but
His brother has it.
His brother has it, and the thing about it is that Clark was very meticulous. He kept things. He was a record keeper. I mean, his correspondence was voluminous. This isn't there. I don't know if it was. I just don't know. The other letters that are missing are the letters that he wrote to his wife, who died. He buried both of his wives. He buried 3 children. He had a lot of tragedy in his life, and yet he held with it. His letters to Julia, I wish I could see those. They would be so revealing. But obviously they were, and we know he wrote letters because there are hints of where that he did. But all of his other, or most of his other letters are there because he was a careful record keeper and methodical about how he approached things.
So Larry, maybe we should turn to the...
Yeah, well, first, before we do that, why don't you address what Jefferson writes at this point? I don't know if you've got that letter there, but...
No, I don't, but what happens is that Lewis, presumably, let's just say for the moment, he commits suicide, and the news comes to Jefferson in a letter from a man named James McNeely, who was actually a near eyewitness, and he helped to get Lewis buried, and he had Lewis's personal effects, and he forwarded Lewis's trunks, and he was the person who he was an informal executor after Lewis's death, and he writes to Jefferson saying, I'm sorry to report that the governor is dead, and I'm sorry to say by his own hand. And Jefferson receives this letter, and he immediately accepts that it's true. And then Lewis is not a slaveholder so far as we know, but he certainly has a free black servant named Pernier, and Neely sends Pernier back to Monticello to brief Jefferson. And that confirms the story. So then Jefferson helps to get Lewis's personal effects sorted out, and he enlists Clark to write the book, and Jefferson handles it the way you'd expect Jefferson to handle it. But then Jefferson writes a biographical sketch of Lewis for the publication of the journals. The journals are put together with Clark's supervision by a man of letters named Nicholas Biddle. And he dumps all the science out of it and just publishes a kind of adventure narrative, really, of the expedition. Comes out in 1814, and one of his sub-editors, a man named John Allen, writes to Jefferson and says, hey, would you write a little biography of Lewis to help this book be more interesting? And so Jefferson does. And that's a very important document, because in it Jefferson says, Lewis had a drinking problem. I noticed during the time that he was my secretary in the White House, and the phrase Jefferson uses is sensible depressions of mind. He says that he was a man of melancholy, and that hypochondria is the term Jefferson uses, existed in both branches of his family. In other words, he inherited a melancholic disposition from his mother's side and from his father's side. And Jefferson says, I saw it in the Lewis family in my own experience in Virginia. And then he says on October 11th, 1809, he did the deed which is which has put the whole country into mourning over this great man. But then Jefferson goes one step farther. So all these are really important parts of this story. Then Jefferson says, and unless you think that I'm just speculating here, I know this to be true because I saw this mental illness or mental instability in the family. I saw it in the White House. I know what I'm talking about. You can be sure that that's exactly what happened out there. You know, it's as if he anticipates that there will be people who are uncertain about what happened. And Jefferson closes the door on it, says, I'm the former president. I'm the person who knew him as well as anyone, except possibly Clark. I tell you, the man committed suicide. Now, he doesn't do it in such blunt language, but it's very diplomatic and very Jeffersonian. But what he's basically saying is, there's no mystery here. It's sad, but there's no mystery. And so that document would, I think Dr. Foley will agree, that would appear to be definitive. But there are people who say Jefferson is covering up, that he's just trying to close the books on the case, that he's part of a conspiracy to kill Lewis, etc. But how do you read that?
Yeah, there's no doubt in my mind, but there's doubt in some people's minds, and I suspect it will continue regardless. Clay's book, I think, provides the most thoughtful kind of analysis of the issues and providing a context for understanding it, but it won't convince some.
Before we go to, what I'd like to do, is Robin around?
Robin's
Do we have a
mic.
handheld mic that we can, and it's really important, okay, thank you, Robin. It's really important you use the mic because this is being taped and that's how we pick up
But Larry,
your
just before we
questions.
do it,
But
there was
before
one
we
more
do that-
question that's really important, and that is Sacagawea. You know, there's all this talk about romance between Sacagawea and Clark. What's the relationship?
Clark was very fond of her and of Charbonneau. Lewis didn't hold him in high regard either. But when they on the expedition, Sacagawea and Charbonneau always traveled with Clark wherever they went. And after they got back, and as they were preparing to come down river, Clark and of course the baby that was born on the way, Pomp, and Clark wanted to bring him back to St. Louis, and the parents said no. The mother said no. He's just because he was not quite 2, I guess, and he's too little to go down. And in fact, they depart, and Clark makes some sort of a statement. I'm missing the little boy, you know, and my darling, whatever. So there was this relationship. But he tells Charbonneau, he says, if you will come to St. Louis, I'll get you some land. And so they show up in 1810, Clark happens to be gone. He's back east at the time. The baby is baptized at the cathedral in St. Louis, but it doesn't work out. Charbonneau and Sacagawea are not particularly, that's not their place. They don't feel comfortable on a farm someplace. So they go back up the river, but they leave the boy there, and Clark is sort of his guardian and sees to his education. Eventually, Pomp goes to Europe, spends time in Germany with a prince that had been visiting, comes back. So there was a connection. There was one other little piece. A trader came down the river subsequently, I think it must have been 1812, and brings a child, which he says is named Lisette, a little girl, who he says is Charbonneau's child. Now the question is this, well, is this his child by Sacagawea, who had died just a short time before? You know, maybe did she die as a result of childbirth or whatever? Lisette comes down, but then she's lost in the records, except that the orphan court has, and initially they assigned her to this trader, but somebody marks it out and writes Clark's name in that she's going to be the ward. But then we never see anymore. The point is, he was really connected with that family in a way that Lewis wasn't.
And he wrote that remarkable letter on the 20th of August, 1806, saying, basically, I'm not ready to say goodbye to you folks. Yeah. What a strange letter for an Army officer to write.
Okay, we're going to go to questions, but first let's finish this off with sort of I guess the capstone of the Lewis and Clark partnership, which I think is William Clark's letter to Biddle, who is publishing the book, and correct me if I'm wrong, isn't it Biddle that says, how would you describe your relationship?
Biddle is writing this book, and Lewis is dead, and Biddle has been given this unpleasant task. He's never been west of the Alleghenies, and he's got to write this story. And he sends long lists of questions to Clark, and they're wonderful, they're amazing, they're published in a book by Donald Jackson called The Letters of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, and they're actually been a neglected document, but incredible. So he'll say, well, what was the color of the Mandan's hair, and how, describe the Sacagawea, and when you say that the Flatheads did not flatten their head, then why are they called flatheads? And just lots of queries to try to clarify this mass of really odd information, and then they're back and forth. And Clark sends George Shannon, the youngest member of the expedition, off to serve as his personal liaison with this guy and to help answer questions. Well, anyway, as he's getting close to publication, Biddle starts to think about this and says, well, I know that Clark was really just a lieutenant, and Lewis was a captain, and it was really Jefferson gave Lewis the command, and now we're calling it Lewis and Clark, Lewis and Clark. And so he writes this very careful letter to Clark, very deferential, saying, how do you want me to handle the relationship? And so pick it up from there.
And obviously this is still a sore point with Clark, and he says, you know, we were equals in every respect. I mean, so he carries it on, and Lewis is gone. Now you've got to get Clay's book because we didn't have time to get into it, but he raises some very interesting things about part of Lewis's struggles to write this book is most of these great scientific expeditions like Captain Cook and so on, and that was to be the model, and that was the kind of work that the books that they wrote were what would be expected of Lewis. But there was one person that was in charge, so how was he going to handle this Clark thing? And didn't want to hurt his feelings, but he didn't want to undercut his importance, and you know, so it's interesting. I think Lewis was gone now, but Clark is determined to sort of set the record straight, because later on Biddle is procrastinating, and Clark writes him a letter and says, get with it, and he says something about, I don't recall the exact wording, but what can I do to get you to finish the story of the expedition of Lewis and Clark? I mean, he's sort of saying, okay.
He's trying to make sure that Biddle doesn't write a Lewis story.
Yeah, that he doesn't write him.
Right. So it's a very delicate, but I think you say in your biography that there was an earlier draft of Biddle's letter, and he was clearly worried about
how Clark was going to respond to this.
And of course Jefferson is still alive, and for Jefferson it's still Lewis's project. Even after this, Jefferson's writing to Clark and saying, I need you to take care of these from Mr. Lewis's late tour. And so that had to rankle poor Clark. Lewis is dead. He didn't write the book. He failed in a number of respects. Clark's putting it all together, and now Jefferson is rebuking Clark and saying Lewis's late tour. So this is, we grew up, Larry, thinking Lewis and Clark, Lewis and Clark. And we never thought twice about it. But when you actually start to unpack this, it's much more complex. The relationship and what would have happened in the book and their place in history and Jefferson's understanding of it. And it's very interesting and rich and troubling in some ways. And Clark was really never given his due until the bicentennial.
I did, a number of years ago, I did an essay on how the British responded and viewed the expedition. And Lewis in many of these accounts, they would refer to it as Captain Lewis's tour or his expedition and so on.
And you have a couple slides here of the expectations.
The expectations of what they anticipated that this work was going to be like, and Captain Cook's voyages was the model, and you can see here the illustrations and so on, and then they get when Biddle's edition and, well, Patrick Gass's first comes out, and they're just shocked. This is just kind of a
primitive.
So
there's Captain Cook, gorgeous folios, professional woodcuts, all this great anthropological data, and then here's the illustration.
Here's the illustration that showed up in Gass.
A bear and a guy in a tree,
Well, that's the Americans. They're just way behind us.
So, then here's Captain Cook. Then here's Gass, Lewis, shouting at the Indians. And so the Europeans were snobby about this and said, you call this an Enlightenment journey and an Enlightenment report?
And Clark must have been aware of some of this.
I just love that of the...
Yeah, that's...
So let's do... some questions.
Okay, we've got a microphone here. If anybody has any questions for Dr. Foley or Clay. Make Mike stand up.
Keep standing up, yeah. Mike McCormack, when you talked about Lewis and the way he was described by Jefferson, lots of buzzwords, melancholia pop up. If a modern psychiatrist had him on a couch today, would he be diagnosed as a manic depressive? And maybe he functioned as well as he could if he suffered from that.
I'll let you handle this one.
Well, let me say, and I hope you'll agree, as a historian, I'm very reluctant to diagnose people using 20th century terms that didn't exist in the time. In other words, if you ask me just informally over a drink, what was Lewis's problem, I would say that he suffered from deep depressions. And I do also believe at the end of his life he was toxic, that he was chemically toxic. He had been taking laudanum, which is an opium derivative. He was drinking far too much. He had malaria. He was dosing himself with salts and mercury and all this stuff. The medicine of the time was just deplorable, almost barbaric. And Lewis is dosing himself heavily with this stuff. And so he's probably toxic. And the malaria that he had was a severe form, probably, and it creates mental instability, among other things. And the mercury, as we know from the phrase "mad as a hatter," can create mental instability. And so all those things seem to me clear, but whether he was a manic depressive, whether he was clinically depressed, it's hard to know, because we can't get him on a couch, and we have to take these phrases and these inferences from records, and this is not a Dear Diary situation where people unfold their personal feelings. They're very reticent in the 18th and early 19th century, so we just don't know. But I'll say this much, and I want you to talk about it too, Bill, but I found the most interesting thing in the journals. Lewis has long periods of silence, goes for weeks, even months with silence. But whenever he starts to write again, he says something like this: "Having confined myself for a period of time on the boats, today I walked on shore with my dog and my rifle." And when he says that, he's up and running, and he writes for the next 2 months. Every time he comes out of a silence, he says, "Having been sedentary for some time, today I took exercise." And as his therapist, you want to say, take more exercise. Because that happens to people who are manic depressives, that if you can get your body moving, if you can get something going, other parts start to click in. And Lewis never seems to have looked in that mirror and said, I should get off the boat more. But maybe he was incapacitated. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, it's hard to say. There's a new study out on Lewis that I'm not particularly recommending, but it's interesting. And they argue he argues that Lewis was too busy doing all these other things, but
to keep a journal.
Keep a journal, and so these silences really don't indicate anything. But I think they probably do, because Clark was drawing maps and keeping a journal and doing all these things, and he still had time. So I think there's.
So we don't know, but
We don't know, but it's.
But Jefferson's phrase is hypochondria, and if you look that up in the Johnson's Dictionary of 1755, or in the Oxford English Dictionary, or in the medical treatises of the time, hypochondria means deep depressiveness. And the fashionable term in Jefferson's era was melancholia, which we don't use in quite the same way in our time. But Jefferson says in his biographical sketch, Lewis was a depressive. I noticed it in the White House. And then he says, very fascinatingly, I thought that by sending him on this journey, one of two things would be true. Either it would put that into abeyance while he was out there, or it would cure him. But when he came back, and then Jefferson says, and found himself in sedentary situations, it came back more pronounced, and then he says it was coupled with a habit into which he had fallen. And almost every historian believes that habit is alcoholism or abuse of alcohol. And so Jefferson is saying categorically, he was a depressive person. I noticed it before the trip. It didn't trouble me too greatly. I thought the trip would be good for him, but when he came back, it came in a more severe form.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
But Clark, I mean, people say, well, why would he choose Lewis then? You know, this guy he's already noticed has mental instability, but he must have thought it was okay. But then Clark becomes even more important. If you think of that, Lewis is a troubled man from the beginning. He knew, Lewis did, that Clark was his go-to guy. Can you talk about that letter he wrote recruiting Clark, saying, come for part of it? Or?
Yeah, and if you don't think you can go with us part way, and there's no person I would rather have that I know of to undertake this. And this was his decision. It was interesting, I think, that Secretary of War Dearborn, this was all, the selection of Clark was all Lewis's doing. But when Jefferson told Dearborn that he had selected Clark, Dearborn says, I think the chances for success are improved, or something to that effect.
Oh, as opposed to just Lewis?
Yeah.
Okay.
So now maybe he was just saying having two, but.
Okay, any other questions?
Stunned silence.
Stunned. A stunned audience.
Alas. Here's one, right here. Then we'll close.
Yeah, it's quarter till.
Paul Nelson, I'm just thinking that you might be kind of Harrison Ford type of historians. If you were going to go after some kind of information, you talk about letters that disappeared or weren't there, what kind of information would you go after?
Oh, that's great. What would you look for if you had X-ray vision?
I would look for, first of all, Clark's letters to Julia. I would be interested if there were these journals that Lewis kept that have disappeared, as some think, they have anything. One of the reasons that Jim Holmberg's, the letters that were found to his brother, Clark was much more revealing to family than he was in terms of official correspondence. And that's where he really sort of lets his hair down and says what he thinks. So wish we could find more of those family letters. Clarks were letter writers. They all wrote back and forth, and of course that was a day and time when that's how you communicated.
Yeah.
You didn't get on the phone, or you didn't.
No emails.
No emails.
Yeah. So letters to Julia would be your
That's
treasure.
one thing I'd like to see more about. He was devoted to her, no question about it. She died quite young.
You said what, breast cancer?
I think it was breast cancer. She had a very difficult delivery of their last child, who had cerebral palsy, I think, and died at 13.
Clay, what would be your treasure?
Well, in this context, we're talking about Lewis and Clark today, the suicide letter, the so-called suicide letter.
That would be.
I'm afraid if we found that letter, we'd be disappointed by it. I don't think it said, I can't take it anymore, and I'm going to show them. And,
Goodbye, cruel world.
yeah, exactly. I think it said something like, I might change course, I might not go to Natchez in New Orleans, I might go cross country, and if something should happen to me, here's what you do with the papers. And it might have said something like, and Lewis was very prone to melodramatic statement. You know, on the expedition, he's always saying, if such and such happens, it, quote, might defeat the expedition altogether. Clark never talks that way. Clark's view is, we'll regroup, we'll get by, we'll get through. But Lewis is always saying something is going to defeat the expedition altogether. And so I think that if that is a suicide letter in any meaningful sense, and I don't think it is, but I think it would say something like, my enemies are crowding about me, and it would be better for me to take my own life than to give them the pleasure of destroying me. He did say something like that informally on the trail, on the Natchez Trail. So I'm guessing there, but if I'll change the question slightly. What I would like to do is two things. One is to spend one day on the Lewis and Clark Trail. If you could spend one day on the Lewis and Clark Trail, we could solve a lot of these mysteries instantly. We'd see so many things that are not written up because, remember, here's the most important thing you can ever know about Lewis and Clark. They didn't know we'd be sitting here. So they never thought, we'll describe X and Y and Z. I'll tell you what each man's character is. I'll tell you who had a beard and who didn't. I'll tell you who was funny or who was obnoxious or who smelled or who mouthed off. They never talked that way because they didn't know we would care. We don't think that way about the Zebulon Pike expeditions. We don't ask those questions because we think, it's a deal. But with Lewis and Clark, we want to know everybody's characteristics. We want to know what Sacagawea looked like. Yeah. We don't. We want to know whether Lewis was secretly drinking. We don't. There are hundreds of questions you would create and say, if I could go there, I'd look and try to observe this. What does Clark ever mistreat York on the trail? Does York mouth off to Clark? Is Lewis contemptuous of this relationship between Clark and York, et cetera, et cetera? I mean, endlessly. And you could solve most of those problems if you could actually be there. The number one question I get asked, and I'll bet you too, is what happened to the dog? Oh, okay. The dog disappears from the journals, but it doesn't mean it disappeared from their lives. The journals are only a very fragmentary record of things that happen to get noticed on any given day. And if, let's say, Larry, you were the best member of the expedition, but you didn't ever mouth off, you never got hurt, you never got stuck in a difficult situation, you might never appear in the journals except during the musterings, the rosters, because you would be so reliable and so unexceptionable that you never rose above the radar, and yet you might have been one of the best members. But if you were Charbonneau and you screwed up, you get noticed. If you shoot the captain, you get noticed. If you get sick, you get noticed. If you die, you notice. The people who got noticed were people who did things that were out of the norm or that were so remarkable that the captains had to attend to them. But most of the members just did their work and drank their grog and slept.
Well, and even Sacagawea, who has now become, of mythic import, and so she is very, very infrequently mentioned. They're just very brief.
Couple dozen.
Yeah, references to her in all of the journals for all the expeditions. So, you wish, well, we'd know more, but.
Jim Ronder wrote a famous paragraph about this, and he's such a great Lewis and Clark scholar, but he said, Shannon got lost, and William Bratton had a lower disc problem, and John Potts got drunk. And he said, we're so desperate to know about this that we've taken those little fragments and we've locked in each person's character according to that moment. Well, that doesn't necessarily give us a just picture of what happened. It means that we have no choice but to lock these people into these stereotypes that if they were here, they might say, that wasn't my contribution to the expedition. But we have no choice.
Right. Okay, any other questions? Oh, we've got a question down here.
There's one
Robin,
down here.
Please.
Two, maybe. And then we should really
Maybe
go.
two more questions, and then we're going to have to.
Thank you for your time. We have a pretty good idea why Lewis asked Clark to come with him. Why did Clark say yes to Lewis?
He was looking for a job. He had put hints out. Had his brother, he pretty well taken. He'd resigned from the army, and he had sorted out to the extent he could George Rogers Clark's affairs, and so now he needed to move on. And George Rogers even wrote a letter to Jefferson saying, my younger brother could, has a lot of skills, and if you have a post for him. So I think it came along at a point when he was needing something to do.
But glory too. I mean,
Yes, and then the glory that would come from this. This was better than he could have anticipated. It was better than a clerkship or something.
Was there one more?
Was there another question down here? Okay.
Larry, let me
Now,
say, I want to say something. Well, first of all, I want to thank Bill Foley for coming. We'd spent such a marvelous 4 days, and I hope you'll agree to come back to see North Dakota a couple of years from now. Just two little loose ends. We talked about John Kennedy in November, but next year, say what we're going to do.
Well, there's a setup. Actually, we are going to do a symposium. Many of you know that we've had two symposiums. We had Eric Severide Symposium, and we had the 9/11 Symposium last year. And this next November, 2013, now hold on to your seats on this, 50th anniversary of the assassination of Jack Kennedy. And so we're going to have a 3-day symposium here with the Dakota Institute and Fort Mandan
and the State
Historical Society. And what we're going to do is we're going to examine Kennedy's administration, not just focused on the assassination, but the Kennedy administration. But what's really exciting is Clint Hill, who's the guy you'll remember from North Dakota that climbed on the back of the limousine, and he was Mrs. Kennedy's Secret Service agent. He is going to be the keynote speaker on November 5th, 2013. And then the next day, he's going to talk about a new book he's got out called Mrs. Kennedy and Me, I think, and it's photographs. And he's going to give us the insight, even to include little John's salute during the funeral and why that happened the way it happened. So this is very exciting, and we're going to do that in 2013.
The 5th, 6th, and 7th of November, 1 year from now, on the 50th anniversary of the assassination of JFK. And anyone who's old enough remembers where you were. And
this crowd doesn't look old enough. There's a lot of young people here.
So we'll do that.
You want to say something else?
I just want to say that those two books are for sale, but at long last, as far as I'm concerned, my book on North Dakota is out, and the launch is going to be here at BSC on the 23rd of October. So we're not sure where yet, but it's going to be for sale in all the bookstores and so on. But we're going to have the launch event here at BSC probably and certainly the date is the 23rd of October. So that's that. But your book is for sale in the lobby.
So thank you both very much. This has been exceptional. I think that we in North Dakota are incredibly lucky that Clay Jenkinson ever moved back to this state. And I was first introduced to Clay through his writings in the Bismarck Tribune. And I read in there a statement, he said, conversations that North Dakotans need to have. And that struck me. It struck me so much that I found out how to get a hold of him, and through my office contacted him and said, we need to go to lunch.
I'm a North Dakotan. I moved away for a long time. I came back in 2005, and shortly thereafter, the new president of Bismarck State College, Larry Scogan, called me and said, let's have lunch. And he said, I've been reading some of the things you've been writing in the Bismarck Tribune. You've called for a statewide dialogue on certain sorts of questions about who we are, where we're headed, what we value. He said, I want to make that happen at Bismarck State College. And so we began to talk about a series of events, including public lectures, which would raise questions about this place and its future.
So we sat there at lunch the first time, and the first time I'd ever met Clay, and he talked about the conversations that he believed North Dakotans that needed to have relative to water and to the future of the land and the future of our people. And I thought, man, what an engaging gentleman he is.
North Dakota is at a crossroads. From 1889 until about 1989, we were a profoundly agrarian place. Since 1989, we've been moving into a sort of a post-agrarian phase of our history, and nobody is quite sure what that means and where we're headed, or what the identity of North Dakota will be in the 21st century and beyond. And we both believe that this dialogue desperately needs to take place, that it's not taking place very systematically in North Dakota, that in some sense North Dakotans are in a way afraid of that conversation or in denial about that conversation because things are going well. And I think we're partly afraid of what we'll learn if we dig in too much about who we are and where we're headed.
So we just started having these conversations as individuals and developed a friendship in that. And then I thought, well, it would be wonderful to have Clay on our campus. Bismarck State College, a community college in the center of North Dakota and the capital city of North Dakota, to be able to have really a world-renowned scholar lecturing on these topics.
When President Scogin invited me to give these lectures, I said I'll do it on one condition, that they be conversations. I think that in a real conversation, it's 1 + 1 = 3 or 5 or 10. And so he somewhat reluctantly agreed to do this, but the conversations have really worked.
I am so proud. I feel incredibly fortunate to be the president of Bismarck State College. And I want everybody in the community to be as proud of that college as I am. I want people to look at Bismarck State College not just as a place to go for an energy program, not just a place to go for vocational training, not just a place to go for a liberal arts transfer degree, but I want the community coming to Bismarck State College.
I want people to come away realizing that history is never finished. There's no final view of anything. It's always being renegotiated. And it's particularly valuable to see friends who share a great deal of reading renegotiating key events in history. That's one thing. We also want people to realize that North Dakota is not as far out of the narrative as they might think, that Abraham Lincoln had an effect on this place, that World War II had an effect on this place, that the Missouri River is a more important river than we make of it when we just go out on our jet skis or on a riverboat in the evening. So we want people to reconnect this place to a broader historical and social context and appreciate this place more, but also ask questions that don't just assume what we've all been told is the truth.